I watch for a shift in how the person embraces being alive. That's what progress looks like to one of the women. And that's a shift in how the person embraces being alive. That's another way of saying a transformation, how they are with themselves and their life.
Rachel Harris, welcome to the Maps Canada podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Amazing. So for people who don't know, Rachel Harris, PhD, is the author of the book Swimming in the Sacred, Wisdom from the Psychedelic Underground and Listening to Ayahuasca. She's a psychologist who has been in private practice for 4 years, and she spent 10 years in academic research department where she published more than 40 scientific studies in peer-reviewed journals and received a National Institute of Health New Investigators Award. Rachel splits her time between an island in Maine and the San Francisco Bay Area, and you can check out her website, swimminginthesacred.com. Something from Rachel's book, which we'll be discussing today, that stood out was she participated at Esalen in the 60s, the famous original fertile ground for a lot of the significant figures and people have had a lot of impact in the psychedelic space. And even just pulling back for a second, we know that literature is a technology that humans develop to capture our wisdom and to pass it on. And at the core of this book is that there's a wisdom from the psychedelic underground, dating all the way back to Esalen before, that is in danger of being lost as our modern institutions embrace plant medicines. And this book captures some of that vital wisdom. So I really encourage everyone to check out the book, and we'll be talking into some of the things discussed in the book today. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Great introduction.
Amazing. Awesome. Yeah. So, maybe diving right in, what is the wisdom that you mentioned that is at risk of being lost, and maybe give us some context into the book?
Yeah. So I interviewed women who had been practicing underground, leading ceremonies, guiding ceremonies underground for at least 20 years. And in fact, most of them had been working underground for 30 or 40 years. And just to give a context, one woman, this is the book I always recommend, The Secret Chief. It's actually online through Maps. It's an interview with Leo Zeff, and one of the women had trained with him. So you understand that her training happened in the early 60s. So these women really go way back. And then she influenced a number of these women. And most of the women sort of knew each other, but not all of them. So I interviewed more widely than they realized. I mean, at one point they thought they knew everybody, and I said to them, well, do you know someone from Maryland? And they said, where's Maryland? It was a lot of West Coast people. So, I knew they didn't know the person from Maryland. She had a very different story. But that gives you a clue about how far back these women have been practicing. And they had a vow of silence that they had never opened up. And I could go even further, and that is that the eldest of the elders, she was she was a teacher for many of the other women, and she really held the vow of silence very seriously. And when I emailed her, I had a couple of referrals to her, but it was still a cold email. And she wanted to check on me, so she called someone she knew in California, and the woman she called had been already one of my interviewees. So, it was one of those really interesting serendipitous kinds of things. And I could go even further and say, when I arranged to meet her, this is the eldest of the elders, and she had a big influence on me too. And I'm not sure I did justice in the book to how much I was influenced by these women and changed by them, because they really touched me in very deep ways. But as I pulled up to the house where this eldest of the elders was staying, she was waiting for me in the garden. I get out of my car we look at each other and we recognize each other. I had been living at Esalen, and she had been coming to Esalen for training workshops in Gestalt therapy. So we knew a lot of people in common, and it really opened up a very deep and powerful conversation. And I didn't just do an hour interview with these women and then write about it. I met with her a few afternoons, and then I called her many times with very specific questions. And there's some women I spent days with. I moved into their house. I visited with them for days. So these were really in-depth, heartfelt interviews.
And that totally comes across like it feels there's like a very honest tone to how you share their stories and your interactions with them. It's not like some like invisible third person like observing them from afar.
No.
Like you
No.
put yourself into it. So and yeah, I gotta say the maybe the most striking thing is the training and apprenticeship, the authority, the amount of years, the intensity, and the thoroughness of the training that these elder women went through to come to be who they are and to help people in the capacity that they do, and just how different that is from, at least what I've seen from, psychedelic therapist training in the new wave of the psychedelic renaissance. Could you speak to the difference between sort of like how much goes into becoming like a traditional healer, or the different words that we use for these people, shaman, etc., versus the modern like psychedelic therapist?
Yeah. Thank you. It's a great question.
Hey, we hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. Now, if you want to support and become part of the psychedelic movement, feel free to donate to MAPS Canada at the link in the description below. Thank you for helping our mission to support equitable access to legal and regulated psychedelic medicines for all Canadians.
Let me just say ahead of time, I interviewed at this depth 15 women. I interviewed a bunch of other people around them, but the 15 really qualified. And all of them had served years of apprenticeship, generally 6-7 years. That's what it looked like. And an apprenticeship is when you sit at the elbow, so you're sitting right close. I want to say, I think just two or three of the women were trained by shaman. One by Southeastern shaman, which is completely different, and the other two by Peruvian, South American shaman, Peruvian. And one of the women who had been trained by a Peruvian shaman said, the shaman, after 6 years or so, said, "You're ready to sing in the ceremony." And she said, "No, I'm not." And she waited another year, and what she did during that year is during the ceremonies, she sat right next to, at the elbow of this powerful shaman, and the shaman would sing, and she would sing like 1 nanosecond right behind him. So it would almost be synchronous. She knew the song, she knew the Icaros, but she was following him for that year. And during the ceremony, they could whisper to each other and compare what they're seeing. That's what a real apprenticeship looks like. You're right there at the elbow, and you're osmosing. You're sort of picking up intuitively what's happening. Now, I could add, this is not something I talked about in the book because it's a totally different source of information, and that is that I'm dear friends with a Jungian analyst. And I've known him for 6 or 7 years, so I met him right at the beginning of his apprenticeship with a Shipipo shaman. And for 6 years or so, I asked him the same question again and again. Are you in training to be a better Jungian analyst, or are you in training to be a shaman? And all along he basically said, I'm in training to be a better Jungian analyst. This will make me a better healer. But no, that's not what the shaman was doing. The shaman was training him. And so he's at 6, almost 7 years, he's right at the cusp of, well, here's the example. The shaman said you can pour your own medicine. So this is sort of like a graduation event. that you can pour your own medicine, meaning you can also pour it for other people, but that you have reached the point where you can pour your own medicine. You don't need me, the shaman, to pour it for you. That's after 6 or 7 years. Now, I have to have some perspective here. And the psychedelic therapists needed, at this point, they can't take 6 or 7 years. And it's very hard to, and they can't all travel to Peru and work with a shaman. And it's very hard to find an apprenticeship with one of these elders. They are secretively underground. Please don't ask me to connect you to any of them. I'm sworn to secrecy.
Right.
So I realize how hard it is for the therapists. But I maintain that they can make an effort. And they can do more than just a couple of ketamine trips or one MDMA trip. The more experience they have themselves with all the different medicines, the more they will know in their bones, in their own psyche, the terrain that they're traveling with their clients. And so I'm in this awkward position of saying get more experience, knowing that this is illegal, basically, mostly. But there are ways and places to get experience, and I encourage them to do so. The other thing I want to add is when I started out, I thought these women that I was interviewing, I thought they were therapists, and I was pretty quickly corrected on that. They are not therapists. They're not trained. The one or two of them have a license and a practice, but they kept their underground work really separate. So they were ceremonialists. They were high priestesses. And that's a very different role than a therapist. And we've now currently combined these roles of being both a therapist and a sitting guide. And I think these are two very different roles with very different training and very different experience. And I think we're asking too much of the psychedelic therapist. And that's just beginning to be explored.
Right. And to further elaborate on that distinction between the sitter, so someone who's just there with the person while they're in the journey and all the complexities and
Thank you.
Unexpectedness and stuff that can happen, versus what we call the integration afterwards and the screening and preparation in advance being more like, and to clarify, so for you, that's more the psychotherapeutic modalities, as in those conversations before and after, and then the more shamanic practices and skills and abilities is during the sitting?
Yes, correct, exactly. And I want to say something about integration. So I'll quote one of my chapter headings, which I'm very fond of, and I was very glad the editor let me keep it. And I forget which number chapter it is, but the title of the chapter is, "What the hell is integration anyway? We don't really know." And let's
Chapter
be honest,
7?
and I'm speaking as a psychologist and as a lifelong therapist. I have a research background, but I also had a private practice for 40 years. And I worked with a lot of people who had experience in altered states from a number of different sources, and also people on spiritual paths and in altered states from those experiences. And it's not like we really know what we're doing when it comes to integrating these journeys, and it's very different with different medicines and different situations and different people. So I think we have to be very clear that we're in a learning mode. As therapists, I'm speaking as a therapist now.
Totally.
I just read an article earlier this morning that someone sent me, and it's from a VA journal for Vietnam veterans, and they're using. I really like this phrase. It was, I may not be getting this right, but I can text it to you later. But it was they were using as sitters, as guides, experienced peers. So they were not therapists, but they were veterans who had also suffered with PTSD. So they were real peers, but they were experienced with different psychedelic journeys. And I thought, boy, this is wonderful. I'm not sure we need therapists to sit there for 6 or 8 hours, but you do want an experienced peer. So I, you know, and this of course is more cost effective. You don't have to pay a therapist. So and you know, I was listening. This is an Esalen podcast, Esalen Institute podcast with Bessel van der Kerk, who has been, you know, he wrote The Body Knows the Scores. Do I have that title right? And so he's been a leader.
The Body Keeps the Score.
Keeps the Score. Thank you. He's been a leader in trauma therapy, and this is the first. And I've heard him speak in professional settings on this Esalen podcast. This is the first I've heard him talk about his own psychedelic experience in the '60s. And one of the things he says is that for the psychedelic therapist being the guide sitting, is that mostly you should keep your mouth shut. This is not a time to prove how insightful you are as a therapist. Mostly you should say very little. And, you know, therapists have a hard time not being brilliant therapists. This is not easy for them to keep their mouth shut, as you can see with me. I mean, just in this. So I thought, you know,
to write a book about it.
Yeah, really. So this is, you know, it's a very different role and a very different training and a very different gift. So I'll be quiet now.
Oh, no, please. Yeah, totally. It makes sense that those are separate. It seems it's almost like to charge a therapist. I mean, they are an authority in the West, and they're people that people trust, and that trust is such a key thing. And having, like, trusting the person holding space for you is so key to prime yourself and be in a good headspace. So there's that element. At the same time, for them to sit there most of the time when things are going, or it's an inner experience for you and there isn't much happening on the external, then it's almost like, okay, why are we having to pay this person so much for so long to sit there? So
we've been using two therapists.
And two of them.
Right.
Totally. And when they're needed, they're absolutely crucial. And when they're not, it feels like, what are we doing? You know? So it's an interesting question.
Well, the crucial part of that raises the question of safety. And so there always has to be built-in safety. Totally. And when I hear, you know, I have a lot of sources of information, and when I hear, what was this? Someone went to a sound healing with, I think they took MDMA and then they took mushrooms. So I don't know what the hell. They didn't know what they were taking. They were never interviewed about their medical history or if they were on any SSRIs, antidepressants, which is a concern. It can be dangerous, medically dangerous. So there was no medical intake. There was no screening. And there were 60 people in the group. A sound therapist, who knows what that is, and 5 helpers. And that's not enough safety. So one of the concrete things I tell people is if you have not been given a full medical screening, don't go to that ceremony. And always ask how many people are going to be in the ceremony, how many helpers. These are concrete things that you can ask so you know whether you're going to be safe or not. And I also have to add that these women I interviewed, one woman had like a 16-page medical questionnaire that the client had to fill out. And then she would go over it and then consult with a physician or a psychopharmacologist. These women, they're underground, but they're not alone underground. They have colleagues, they have experts helping them, and they can always consult.
Got it.
Because
That's awesome.
at the MAPS meeting, I can't tell you how many adorable 20-something-year-olds came up to me and told me they were an underground therapist. And the first question I would ask them is, do you have a medical consultant? They would say, what for?
Right.
It's not safe. It's not safe.
Yeah, for sure. And
so the risk is serotonin syndrome. If you're already on an SSRI antidepressant and you take a psychedelic, you can have too much serotonin in your system, and it can be deadly.
And also potentially just dampened effect. I think about 50% of people on SSRIs who take psilocybin, it also seems to just do nothing 50% of the time. We're super muted. So you might not even
Yeah.
get the benefit that
Yeah.
you're expecting if you tried to do it for
Well,
potential risk.
if the threat of death doesn't discourage people, maybe that will.
Right, right. Yeah, and this brings up something that we've talked about in Maps Canada a little bit too, is the age-old balance between safety and access. And it needs to be safe, and it needs to be safe. And we see the amount of intense training and apprenticeship that goes into becoming like a really highly authoritative elder to be able to lead these ceremonies that you document with these women in your book. And then we can zoom out and we see the other possibilities of sort of that like peer support you mentioned, of having peers sort of be the sitters for someone in the space. One model for that has been the Zendo project with their
Absolutely.
at Burning Man and other places. I've had the privilege of being a sitter with them. And it's interesting to take away that sort of hierarchy and just knowing that you are just a peer. You're just a peer. Even if you have therapist training, you're just a peer. And they
Yes.
also have medical staff. They have
Yes.
There's always a volunteer on shift with medical training to come do rounds and make sure everyone's safe. And so there's ways to figure out how to maintain that safety while also creating models that allow for access.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a wonderful contribution here. Very important. And great that you've had that experience.
Yeah, it's awesome. And a lot
Yeah.
of the times I'm grateful that it's relatively boring. Someone's, they feel
Yes, of
uncomfortable and they
course.
just want to sleep for 3 or 4
Right.
hours. I'm happy to just sit there.
And feel safe and protected. It's very important.
Totally.
It allows them to sleep.
Totally. Yeah. 100%. Okay, cool. So, something that I really want to ask you about. That's exciting.
Great.
So this is a hot debate, hot topic. There's certain novel psychedelics, if we're going to even use that word, for certain substances where they're trying to create the therapeutic benefit without having the psychedelic or the
Oh, man.
mystical or visionary experience. And some people have talked about whether or not, even in journeys with, say, psilocybin, it is what is at the cause of what's going on here. They're getting curious about it, and there seems to be a hesitation to fully embrace even the word mystical. Like the classic 2006 paper that sort of broke all this into the public was titled like psilocybin occasions
I know, I
mystical
love that
type
verb, yeah.
experiences.
Right.
Occasions, yes. And what do you mean mystical type? Like they don't want to say mystical. There's a hesitation there at least. And
Yeah.
fair enough, right? It's, modern Western science. But, where we're having these experiences and we aren't necessarily clear on what's causing the outcome, that's from our perspective. What did these psychedelic elders, what was their perspective on this?
Well, generally they were horrified. is the quick answer. Just horrified. But let me answer as a psychologist also, and that is that we don't know enough to say exactly what of the experience is leading to the therapeutic outcome. We just don't know. So this attempt to change the experience that has been traditionally over centuries been primarily a spiritual experience. I I'm horrified also. I don't know what else to say. So much would be lost. And we don't really know. But this is an attempt to make it more cost effective, more convenient, more drug-like, more Western approach. But we don't really know if this will work, and there will inevitably be research, experimental design research looking at this. But I'm afraid that's what it's going to take, and I think I'm looking for the opposite of humility. I mean, it just seems
Pride.
so. Yeah, it's even worse than that. It's just
It's
sort
like
of a.
overconfident.
It's
Or
a total missing of the of the whole point. That is, centuries old tradition of working with these medicines has been a spiritual relationship with plants and other worlds, relationship with other worlds and other beings in other worlds. And evidently that's just too messy for some medically oriented biochemists, and they want to short circuit that. So no, this is not something the women would be happy with.
Right. And yeah, I can imagine. I know, Roland Griffiths, before he passed, it's said that he became more and more sort of spiritually oriented as he went later into his life. And despite
As
that,
he approached, that's the euphemism. As he approached death, he
right,
became more open and willing to talk about his own experiences. That's what it took.
right, right. Yeah, death. Yeah, the topic of death
It was
and
death. It was
preparation for death.
mortality. Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah. That's the inevitable, right? The heavy hitter, the
Yes,
thing that you
the
cannot
heavy
avoid.
hitter.
They'll force you to
Right.
reflect, right, on bigger questions, if there is any bigger question than that. And as he came closer to death, let's use
Right.
that language, he became more open to spiritual ideas, to that understanding, to those bigger questions. And as we know, the medical literature is very like scientific, materialistic, keep everything as close to the data as possible, interpret very cautiously, use qualifying language like mystical type, et cetera, et cetera. And we saw how in his personal journey that he became more open to those things, although the literature itself was kept in a certain tone. So I wonder if there's almost like, as we progress and as the research unfolds and as more people have these experiences, it'll kind of be like almost like a joke to ourselves that, when we're writing all these papers, all of us know what's going on under the surface here, but we're just going to talk about the very real frameworks of things like where the ego is in the brain and how the neural correlates for that. At the same time, we all know that in our own experiences, it's been these deeper, numinous experiences that have been an integral part of getting the benefit from these journeys.
Yeah, so I would refer you to Tony Bosis, Anthony Bosis from NYU. He's on the research team at NYU dealing, I think he's been dealing with the terminal cancer patients. And every time he speaks in a conference, he talks about the mystical experience. He's the one who's talking about it most directly, most openly, and most passionately. So look him up on YouTube and you'll find he's a solid researcher.
What was his name again?
Talking.
Anthony. We need to get him on here.
Yeah,
Anthony
Bosis, Bossis from NYU.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. We can reach out to those people and have the conversation. That sounds very interesting. That was that was also one of the striking things from your book was the section where you mentioned that, and I have it here, it's page 95, that the people in that study specifically had, I'll just read it. In the long-term follow-up, 7 of 13, so over 50% of the participants, reported encounters with spirit guides who were recognizable family figures, some of whom had already passed. These guiding spirits, in the form of a vision or a voice, helped the person navigate the psilocybin experience and provide reassurance. And they did more. They apologized, and they expressed their love for the traveler as part of their guidance. Unfortunately, participants were not asked about any ongoing relationships with these spirit guides or how these encounters changed the way these relationships were held by the participant after the ceremony. Like, wow, 50% had that specific experience. I didn't know that. I consider myself up to date on things, but I completely missed that.
This is a real important part of what happens on different journeys. People, one guy I've been tracking for a decade now. I just actually had lunch with him here in Manhattan a few days ago. He talked about he lost a buddy that he'd grown up with, a high school buddy who'd killed himself in his early 20s. That's something that's pretty damn hard to get over. And on a journey, he saw his old, he's 40 something, 20 years later, he sees his old childhood friend, and he talks to him and realizes he's thriving and doing okay, and they talk, and he resolves that trauma of losing his friend to a suicide, which is it's really very difficult to get over. But meeting the person on a journey really is a healing that we don't even know how to understand exactly as Western psychologists, but it happens very frequently. Yeah, there are a lot of research questions we don't know how to ask. And let me go back to the mystical experience for just a minute after referring you to Tony. And you can look him up on YouTube and you'll see what you get. He's really fun.
Sweet.
And the chaplains are beginning to get involved. And especially the academic chaplains. And so one key place for this is the Center for the Study of World Religions, which is at Harvard Divinity School. And if you go to their website, they've been funded by Esalen. I mean, you hear the Esalen theme here. They've been funded by Esalen to do interviews with people. And many of these people are chaplains, and they're talking about mystical experience. And from an academic religion perspective, the psychedelic research is looking at a small sliver of mystical experience. There are many different kinds of mystical experiences, and we have not looked at them. We have not asked about them. So communicating, encountering an unseen, someone who's died is also a mystical experience. And we haven't been asking about that.
Totally. I love
communicating with plant teachers doesn't fit into the Western paradigm.
Yeah. A friend of mine who's very deep in working with psilocybin herself, she mentioned that the spirit of the strain of psilocybin, the blue meanies, have a very cute and funny, like poking at you, like, you don't think blah blah blah, energy to it.
You get a sense that this is real, and she's in relationship.
Totally. Yeah. And so someone like me, very open-minded, I haven't experienced that myself. I'm like, wow, that is very different than the ways I've seen psilocybin be understood in some academic papers. And
they haven't asked yet.
Yeah. And I've heard this phrase many times, and emphasizing that it's very much your relationship to the medicine.
Yes.
But then it begs a question: what's the medicine? What is doing the healing? And maybe I'll pose this as a question to you.
Oh no! Don't ask me that. That's above my
Too
pay
big?
grade.
Okay. Then let's narrow in. So specifically, there's the medicine, and then there's the. It's like it can facilitate connection to unseen others. How is it that that's healing?
It's a great question. It's a total mystery. I have no clue. And I'll tell you where I'm closest to exploring that is with my friend, the Jungian analyst, who's been in training, because this is literally what he's being trained to do. And it's through, in traditional shamanic training, the student diets on different plants, which means they restrict their own diet, their own intake, and they drink a kind of tea made out of that plant. And this can go on for 2 months, 6 months, a very long time. And in that dieta, they gain a relationship, an ally with that plant spirit. And somehow, and here's the mystery part, somehow then that connection to that plant spirit helps to channel the healing through the Icaros. And honestly, that's as close as I can come. But I have two resources for you. One is Jeremy Narby's book that happens to be called Plant Teachers. Have you seen that? That's absolutely an important book because in a conversation with a shaman, and the
Yeah,
shaman is talking.
I've read his other book, the Cosmic Snake, or the Cosmic Serpent, which is
Serpent,
fascinating,
yeah.
but not
This is
plant teachers. Yeah.
this is essential for looking at how does shamanic healing happen. This is the real window into another culture that we we don't even know how to begin to think about or research. And then there was something else I wanted to mention which I now can't remember, but it'll come back around.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So how healing
Sorry.
happens, relationship to the unseen, and one thing that's interesting is, since it's more so the relationship to the unseen and not the specific chemical that's the primary concern, it's not surprising that other psychedelics can similarly be healing in a certain class that provides certain experience. And it's also not surprising that it's not even only psychedelics that can provide these experiences.
Yes, and you know what was really fascinating as I got to know the women, many of them reported very unusual experiences as children, and there's and so I include in the book a questionnaire that one psychologist has used to look at spiritual experiences of children, and these women had very interesting, spontaneous, no medicines involved experiences as children. And you know, there's even some report of Albert Hoffman had a mystical experience as a child, and when he talks about, he went back to LSD 25. He had already put it on the shelf, and he picked it. He said he had an inkling or a premonition to test it again, and that's when he spilled some on his skin and had his own experience, which he recognized because he had that mystical experience in the woods, in the forests of, I think, Germany, when he was a child. A lot of the people involved in this movement, in this whole big story, had very interesting childhood experiences.
Yeah, so interesting. Yeah, and the one thing that also stood out is very strong. The trust that I felt from the stories of these elders was also not just the fact that they were fearless in going into these states, but also that they had like this deep calling for a long time that seemed to extend back to those childhood experiences.
That's
to
correct.
follow this path in their life. So,
Yes.
it wasn't on a whim that they decided to do that. And it's maybe transitions well into the question about interpreting mystical experiences in general and also psychedelic journeys. And I'll offer an example. And at the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference last year in Vancouver, I spoke with a gentleman who was a space holder and ayahuasca facilitator. And he shared the story of how he originally felt the calling to this, that it was in an ayahuasca ceremony that he said that, grandmother ayahuasca was telling me to lead ceremonies. Now, I actually don't know his training or what happened after that, so there is some ambiguity there about that. But you give a warning on and some context on how to interpret, or the challenge of interpreting these journeys in the book.
Well, I went to one of the elders, and I said, people say this to me all the time, and I asked them, well, how many ceremonies have you been in? And they say 5 or 6. It's like, no. And I thought, I don't know what to say to them. What do I say to them? And so the elder said to me, tell them it's a message. It's an invitation to come and study the medicine. It's not an invitation to jump in and start leading ceremonies. It's to come and study. So that was a wonderful answer that affirmed the message they got, but interpreted it very differently. And the word I was looking for that was the opposite of humble was inflated. And so this is the big mistake that we in the West make. Because we are so limited by our materialistic scientific worldview and our cultural inflation and then our personal psychological inflation, we don't understand that we have an opportunity to study and relate to these medicines in ways that could be very healing for both the North and the South, for instance, for all the cultures involved.
100%. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I love this term that you use in the book, compulsive psychologizing. I think we have a few compulsive things that
Yeah.
we do in the West. Compulsive,
Yeah.
like materializing. Oh, what is the material explanation for this? Compulsive rationalizing. It's like, oh, there must be let me think about this logically instead of letting a numinous experience be and sit with it. Compulsive, like cognitizing, like, oh, I need to think about it. And you quote someone who said that we have an agnostic reflex at the same time underpinning those. That
Yeah.
is a challenge in how once we've had these experiences, what do we do with them?
I've been working on this for a long time personally. It's very hard to get out of this cultural conditioning. I'm making progress, but it's very slow. To get out of that materialistic worldview. I'm a Westerner. I breathed it in the air. So it's very difficult to have a really different worldview. It's a real revolution in cosmology. So I've been working on it for quite a while.
For sure. And it's interesting, even after a lifetime, years and years for yourself of tackling it and understanding that there's like a metaphysical element to this, that it's not just personal transformation and understanding of self, it's also how we understand the world, and the intersection of those get blurry the deeper you go into some of these journeys. And that being in the West, if we aren't raised with sort of a worldview that has consciousness at the center, or that at least allows for the possibility of mystical experiences,
Right.
there's a huge barrier to and potential shock that can come from
Yes.
in trying to incorporate at least the possibility for these things into our worldview.
Yes. Yes. So what you referenced using the term shock is from John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist who hypnotized the people who said they had been abducted by aliens. And he talked about ontological shock, that their worldview was just shattered from this, whatever this experience was. And he never says completely what it is, but whatever it is, their worldview is just shattered. And their life is very different after that. And we really don't understand what the hell that's all about either.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we know that DMT, intramuscular DMT, or intravenous DMT, I forget the modality, whatever, DMT, intramuscular, can induce alien encounters, and that I know of a friend of a friend said that she speaks with the Galactic Federation in her journeys. It's like, that's a very, very shocking thing to hear for somebody who isn't familiar with the landscape of potential things you can see in mystical experiences. And it seems like aliens are, we can experience aliens like we experience things like aliens or other entities in these journeys. At least that's something that seems to make sense. But then it begs the question, well, what are these entities? And then we're right back at it. Like,
we're back to the mystery. We're back to the mystery. But you know what's really interesting is some of these alien abduction reports include people who have died. That some of the people who report having been abducted also report meeting people they recognize who have died, who have passed over. And there's just interesting questions being asked about this whole phenomena that go way beyond the psychedelic therapy questions.
Totally.
But there's just a lot of mystery out there.
Yeah, for sure. And leaving space for some things to be mysterious is wise.
And so let me give a reference for this, because otherwise it can sound kind of crazy. And that's Jeffrey Kripal, who's head of the religion department at Rice University. If you look up some of his recent books, or just easier, a podcast where he's talking about some of these very mysterious questions. Um, he's
Cool.
he's highlighting the crossover between abduction experiences and psychedelic experiences. And he's also connected to Esalen. So you get a sense of Esalen Institute has been at the forefront of many cultural movements. I mean, this is seemingly an advertisement for Esalen, but I have no current connection with them. But they've been very brave in these areas that most academic departments have not been. But Jeffrey Kripal is head of the religion department, so you have to give Rice University credit for that.
There you go. It's awesome. And so pulling back from the aliens a little bit, if people don't have those experiences.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, some journeys, some of my journeys, like high dose psilocybin, I just cry for 4 hours, and there's no particularly striking, embodied out of body experience like that. And in terms of like when people have maybe not like so shocking experiences, but just stuff that makes them curious about what they might have seen, if they see, like, they feel like they saw Jesus, or they feel like they saw themselves in past life or something like that, that people can get very caught up in creating narrative and story about these experiences in the same way that we can get caught up in creating narrative and stories about our past and our childhood and things like that. What did, in your personal experience, and also from these elders, what did they recommend when it comes to interpreting journeys like that?
Well, I let me answer. Let me answer first as a psychologist, and then I'll report on the women's perspective. And as a psychologist, I think one of the things that seems to be therapeutically healing is a kind of flexibility and a sort of disidentification, so that we're not so identified with our childhood story, or even building other stories that we then become identified with, that we develop a kind of fluidity in our identification of who we are and how we work. And that fluidity, that flexibility, they can actually look at the brain and say there's a neurological flexibility that follows, is that we become just less rigid, more flexible in our personality. So I would discourage any bigger identification. We don't need any more stories. We've all got childhoods that kind of give us enough stories. We don't need any more. So that's not really all that helpful. It's the flexibility, it's the disidentification that's helpful, and the Buddhists talk about that the most. But let me answer from the women, because I have quotes from them that speak to this in a way that that I find very moving, and it gives you a clue of how different they are from the psychological researchers and the psychotherapists. They are really looking at how do people transform their lives, and if they don't see their client transforming their day-to-day life but wanting to come back and have another experience, they will stop giving them journeys. They want to see transformation in day-to-day life. And I have quotes here because I want to really quote exactly. So here's one. I watch for a shift in how the person embraces being alive. That's what progress looks like to one of the women. And that's a shift in how the person embraces being alive. That's another way of saying a transformation, how they are with themselves and their life. To say thank you for everything is a hard place to get to. That's really about gratitude, even during hard times. This is like way above what psychotherapy. Freud had said psychotherapy is just about being what just it's not about being happy. It's sort of about accepting a miserable life. There was some awful quote like that.
Right.
I don't have that right, but this is way beyond what psychotherapy promises. There's a bigger message coming from the medicine, larger than individual psychological healing. If you keep working with the medicines, it's not just the healing of the personal story, but there's a responsibility. Here's how that's stated. This is by the eldest of the elders. This is, you have this thing about you do a journey, and what do you bring back for your community? We are responsible for our intentions and our choices, responsible to ourselves and to humanity. So you begin to hear how these women have a really big spiritual picture, and it's way beyond what psychotherapy promises or looks for. This is not about personal healing. It's about healing the culture and and humanity. And to be able to say thank you for everything. How do we work with things that are difficult? This is really much bigger. This is really much more philosophical.
Mm.
So
I think transformation is such a key word for all of this.
Yes.
Yeah, something that there's a YouTuber he's on a very different picture and worldview, and he's a Eastern Orthodox Christian icon carver. And
oh, wonderful!
Have you heard of Jonathan Pajot?
No.
Have you heard of him? So
no.
he talks about Christianity in a way that I've never heard people talk about Christianity before, and he says people think of modern Christianity, this sort of like non-mystical, materialist kind of like gutted of its.
He's got to be Eastern Orthodox.
Yeah,
right?
I guess so. They maintained that that allowing for the mystical, and yes. He says like the first call in his religion in Christianity isn't just to like follow the rules. The first call is to transformation. It's like about attention and like putting your attention on Christ and in their worldview, that there's a transformation that needs to happen there. Like the transformation is the keyword. And when I heard that, it's like bells are going off. I'm like, oh, that's cool. That's very different than the way I hear, even therapy. You mentioned psychotherapy. Freud's quote at least was pretty grim, although, lots of Freudian psychotherapists I've heard, like by later in life, like only 5% actually followed his continuing theories and stuff. So whatever he said in the end, maybe even Freudians disagreed with. Transformation.
Would you email me that name, Joseph?
Sure.
Yeah.
Jonathan Patrick. I'll send. He's Canadian.
Oh, Jonathan. Oh, fabulous. The thing about the icons is they're carved out of wood, I think, and at some point they come alive. Sort of like a Pinocchio story. That wood is transformed into something that has magic. That's a relic. Has magical powers in it. This is a terrible job, but there's a transformation in the making of the icon and the impact that the icon has on the person.
Right. I think you'd be very interested in how he speaks about it. It sounds like you know a thing or two. I'm not as well educated there, but speaking of interesting history and interesting people, you talking about Al Hubbard and the story of Al Hubbard was very surprising, and I did not know about it before. Yeah, I'm continuing to learn more and more. I've been in the psychedelic space for like 2 or 3 years now, something like that. I am not a psychedelic elder, that is for sure. But tell us maybe a little bit about Al Hubbard and his story.
Well, here I was writing a book about women elders. I think I spent a good 6 months on Al Hubbard, and and there's just not, you just can't get real information about him. I mean, you can Google him and get information, but he lied and misrepresented so much about who he was. But he is a prime example of, I feel like I had, I feel like I knew him. I spent 6 months with him. I won't go into that. But he had childhood mystical experiences. He had his ongoing relationship with the Virgin Mary. And so he had these early mystical experiences. So when he discovered LSD, he recognized it as a mystical experience. And as he began to work with it and give it to others, it wasn't illegal, so this wasn't underground, but this was, there just were no rules back in the 50s. He did everything to make it an inner experience, to turn it inward. So it was his intuition that developed the protocol that is still being used, with earphones and eye shades to turn inward, with some beautiful arose or artwork, spiritual images in the room, a comfortable kind of living room kind of setting where you're safe, because at that time LSD was being used in hospitals where they were just in a hospital room with people walking in and out. He made it safe in a kind of living room setting. He's the one who developed the concept of set and setting, even though Timothy Leary gets credit for it because he published an article about it in a professional journal. Set and setting came from Hubbard. He understood. And so he's quite an amazing jokester figure.
Mythical
yeah.
jokester.
Yeah,
trickster.
I mean, just Google him and you can read about him. But he gave us so much, and I don't think he's recognized enough. And there's a handbook of psychedelic psychotherapy that came out of the Saskatchewan Hospital. That he
Shout out Canada.
He's recognized as being the source of that handbook. But it was written by I think, a psychologist and a psychiatrist,
Humphrey?
or 2 psychologists. I can't.
Was it Humphrey?
It was out of that.
Humphrey,
it was out of that
Humphrey?
hospital. Yeah.
Right. Got it. Yeah, and it's weird to imagine taking something like LSD or any psychedelic in a hospital bed with people walking around and noises and medical sounds and
nobody there
and
for you. You're basically alone.
Yeah.
It's just the worst.
Like, I would want to close my eyes and put on headphones, that's for sure.
Right.
If I'm in that environment.
Right. Right. So.
And people can also Google, if they want, the term psycholytic, something I've learned in years past, that psychedelic therapy is higher dose, while psycholytic is like lower dose with like talking simultaneously while on the journey.
That's been the primary treatment protocol in Europe. There's a recent paper with something in the title, sort of the forgotten approach, psycholytic, if you can get the research article. It's very important, because I think therapeutically that's a really, it's a whole different approach than psychedelics. So what it looks like is you take a low dose, so you can still talk, so you're not off on a journey. It's given within a therapeutic process. And maybe you take one psycholytic journey a month, and then the rest of the times, twice a week maybe, you do regular therapy sessions. So it kind of loosens that boundary between the unconscious and the conscious. It makes more material available, but it's within the context of psychotherapy. And we haven't even begun to research that in the Western, well, I guess Europe is Western, but in North America.
Right.
And I'll speak for Americans. We still think we're all cowboys, so more is better. Go for it. And the heroic dose. And I don't think that's always helpful.
Right. Oh, and that reminds me. I love that you reference Chris Beisch in the book, whose book LSD and the Mind of the Universe. I interviewed him for my personal YouTube channel. Is incredible. For one, that he did what he did at all is incredible, and then what he shares is incredible. And also that after going through the whole journey, that he would have done it differently had he gone back. That instead of doing the 600 micrograms roughly every month, massive sort of like Stan Grof classic psychedelic dose. He was inspired by Stan Grof's book on LSD, or early book on LSD, and that he would recommend doing other medicines like psilocybin and things that are more grounding, say, at lower doses. Exactly.
And lower doses.
And there's value there. So, yeah, and you know, when I read your book and the wisdom of the women elders in the Psychedelic Underground, or I read a book like Chris Beisch, and after he's gone through everything that he's gone through, these people who have been through so much, done so many, you know, the elders doing very many different journeys and rightfully earning the title spiritual warrior.
Yes.
And like the fearlessness that comes with that, having fear myself going into journeys,
No,
I know how scary it can be.
I think they're fearless before. I think they're you know,
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's part of who they are.
I didn't mean to imply they weren't before. Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
They're I don't even understand that, how some people can just be afraid of nothing. So it's still it's still
Yeah.
you know, I just don't get it really, because I have high levels of fear. So I don't understand it at all. I am not of their ilk. I was the scribe. I could be very clear about that. I wrote down what they said. And I had enough experience and I'd been where they work to understand it. But they are a different species when it comes to fear.
Yeah, it's like I'm imagining there being a job for him, or like a, you know, potential career for him, and if you score really low on fearless, you have like two options. You can be like a deeply trained apprenticed, you know, traditional healer, or you could be
an astronaut,
free rope-free climber.
Oh yeah, right.
Who climbs like the edge of cliffs with no ropes, who also have no fear. Is the other profession that you can do. One or the other.
Which is interesting, because I was spending time with one of the women I interviewed. As I mentioned, you know, these were deep relationships. They still are. And we watched that, the documentary
Free Solo.
Free Solo, thank you. We watched that together.
Yeah. Did they? What was their reaction? How did they feel about it?
Well, they understood it completely. And of course I'm thinking, what is this guy thinking?
Yeah,
what
this
is
guy's
wrong
insane.
With him? It's insane, yeah. But she understood it. So it was right there. I mean, you nailed it exactly. It's the Free Solo, yeah.
Wow, that's funny. So
yeah.
So when I hear these people, you know, share their wisdom, I intend fully to listen to it, take their advice, really take their word for it, and hear them out. Anyone who's gone really deep into it and been through the ringer, and you mentioned how they're very skilled at navigating their own egos, and people who show that ability, that they're people who are very worthwhile to listen to. So I'd encourage everyone to check out your book, read. There's tons of quotes, really, really, really fascinating. Read tons of context. I learned about the history of psychedelics. I learned more about the traditional healing perspective, and specifically the stories of these underground women elders. So we can get close to wrapping up. Is there anything else that you want to share with the audience?
You know, I would say, and again, this is coming from me, not from the women necessarily, but you know, we've sort of held psychedelics in a medical or a psychotherapeutic framework, and there might be value in holding it in a framework of learning. And you know, this comes in part from I can send you the name of the book. I'm not going to bring it up right away, and it's a really boring 400-page academic book by an Israeli psychologist. I don't recommend it. It's just awful to read.
Sure.
But it was out of his own experiences, and then research with, you know, clinical research with other people on ayahuasca. And he talked about ayahuasca as a school. That's the point I'm getting to. He understood it as a school. And I happened to buy an ayahuasca painting by Pablo Amaringo, a famous painter. And he had these little squiggly lines in the painting. I can send you a copy of the painting, a photo.
Sure.
And I asked, what do all these lines mean? And the answer was that Pablo Amaringo said, these are all my diplomas. And there's probably 50 or 70 of them in the painting. These are my diplomas in the school of ayahuasca. So there's a context, a way to hold these medicines, as what do we learn from them? And then how do we integrate our learnings into our lives? And I think that's maybe in a way a bigger way to hold these medicines than just about healing psychiatric diagnoses or symptoms. Mostly we're just looking at symptoms still. And symptoms measured by questionnaires. We're not really looking at how do we integrate the learning into our lives, and that's what transformation looks like.
Right. Amazing. Thank you. And it's funny, it's like these like almost silly questionnaires, mystical experience questionnaires that we have. Silly, I mean, it's great to have something concrete, and so we need something
it's all
to
we
do
know
that.
to do to quantify.
Exactly, right. And then at the same time, I can only imagine the patients being like, this does not capture in the slightest the magnitude of the impact and the direct experience of these things. And within that, there's mystery. Within that, there's things that we can still have conversations about. I really like that ayahuasca is a school and that you get diplomas by studying there. I mean, we understand education in the West.
It's implicit in plant teachers.
Right.
Right? There it is.
True.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Not plant therapist.
Right.
Plant breathwork facilitator. Like.
Yeah.
So funny. Okay, awesome.
I'm David Bronner, Cosmic Engagement Officer at Dr. Bronner's, board member of MAPS. Subscribe to MAPS Canada. Bam!